Makes it a lot easier. Share.
Got it.
Okay, we'll just trust that that is in fact.
The lecture series. Okay. Honors the legacy of the anthropologist Trevor W. Purcell, former chair of the Department of Africana Studies and member of the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Florida. The series invites scholars working in areas of Dr. Purcell's research interests to speak to faculty, students, and staff at USF. These interests include the anthropology of Latin America and the Caribbean, indigenous knowledge, development studies, public anthropology, applied anthropology, and diversity and inclusion.
Where, if we have a moment while we're still waiting, where did he do his field work in the Caribbean?
I think primarily in Jamaica, although Kevin Yelvington, who just signed on, might have some more detail about that.
Right. Well, I know Kelvin from the old days, and I guess he remembers me too. Yes. Hello. Hi. I just mentioned that I know you from the old days. So, hello.
Hi, welcome to the department virtually anyway.
Yes.
It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for agreeing to give this talk. We have a lot of people that are really looking forward to it.
Great. Well, when was the last time we saw each other? Have you any recollection? No, I don't.
Welcome everyone to the 2022 Trevor Purcell lecture. My name is Rebecca Zarger, and I would like to introduce Dr. Kieran Jairam and Dr. E.J. Ford, who are also members of the Trevor Purcell Lecture Committee. And we're happy that you joined us this evening. And I will introduce Dr. Ford, who will then introduce our wonderful guest lecturer that we have for this evening. So take it away, Dr. Ford. I think you might be muted.
Yes, he is muted.
All right, it gets better once I'm actually talking out loud. Dr. Francis Henry, Professor Emerita, is considered to be one of Canada's leading experts in the study of racism and anti-racism. Since the mid-70s, when she published the first study of attitude towards people of color, she has consistently pioneered research in this field. Her most recent book, co-authored with colleagues, is The Equity Myth, published by UBC Press, which reports the results of a 4-year national study of race, racialization, and indigeneity at Canadian universities. She has also researched African syncretic religions, religious movements in Trinidad and Tobago, and Caribbean migration to Canada, and a recent work on women in Carnival. Dr. Henry, if you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you. Well, let me begin by expressing my thanks to the Department of Anthropology here, and especially to Kieran Jairam for first contacting me to begin with, and then proposing this in honor of Trevor Purcell. I am, in fact, very honored to have been chosen to give this address in his memory. First off, I'm going to, despite what I am going to really talk about, as noted in the flyer for this meeting, I am an anthropologist. My MA is both in anthropology and sociology, and my PhD is in social anthropology. My first bit of field work for the MA thesis was studying a Black Pentecostal church in Columbus, Ohio, where I was a grad student at Ohio State University. I developed an interest in fundamentalist religious organizations, particularly those which stemmed from African roots. on syncretic religions as practiced in the so-called New World, and specifically in the Caribbean. I first looked at Haiti, where one of my advisors had worked, but I was too lazy to learn patois. Then I discovered, while reading by a then famed anthropologist and Melville Herskovits, in the appendix to one of his books called Trinidad Village, he writes a short commentary on what was then called the Shango cult, which had Africa. So I figured this was the place. It has everything that I would need to carry out my project. I made my way to Trinidad with help from a Wenna Gren Foundation award and became a field anthropologist. My field work progressed very smoothly. I went back several times to do more field work there in Trinidad. A dissertation was written and I achieved a PhD and also a Trinidadian husband in the process. My next move was to the UK because my then partner, we had not married at that point, could not get into the United States, but he was a member of the Commonwealth. He was able to apply for and receive a fellowship to study theater and stage movement in Canada, which of course is also a member of the Commonwealth. Ergo, the move to Canada, where we legally married and found life somewhat easier as an interracial couple. Remember, this was way back in the early 1960s, and interracial marriage was not yet that popular as it is, for example, today. I was hired, luckily, by McGill University in Montreal and became a member of their then still joint Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I continued my research and more field trips to the Caribbean and especially Trinidad. After 10 years, we moved to Toronto. Now, in the early 70s, it became apparent to me that Canada, while not as racist as the US had ever been and with a very different history, nevertheless had its racist problems, especially after growing numbers of Black Caribbean migrants came there in the 60s, after the UK began closing its doors. My first study of racism in Canada was published in 1975. And then this was followed by a field study called Who Gets the Work? A Test of Racial Discrimination in Employment. Subsequent works dealing with institutional and structural racism in Canadian society followed during the course of my long career. But in between, I never forgot Trinidad and the Caribbean. And I wrote a biography of the head religious leader of the Africanist religion, which by this time was called Orisha. And more recently, I collaborated with a sociology student on 2 edited books on Caribbean migration to Canada, and more recently, the changing role of women in the Trinidadian carnival. So now, finally, on to that I spent my entire life in, the academy, the university. Why? Having already examined in a more general way employment discrimination, I found it quite natural to turn to the one institution I knew best from personal experience of many years. I was also, in the meantime, to have found a research and writing partner. The university has always been defined throughout its history as above it all. And even today, it sometimes does not think of itself as a burgeoning, changing, and disparate society. In many ways, the university is still basically an age-old Eurocentric institution. Universities and colleges and well-known values of society, they believe themselves to be and are generally thought of as bastions of higher learning, which of course they are. But today they are beginning to recognize that they must accept its new status of being a racialized and gendered institution that is historically embedded in coloniality. Not only students experience, but also university faculty have a problematic life in many. The first major study of racialized university faculty in Canada, we, along with other colleagues, collaborated on a nationwide study of racism and racialization, a multifaceted methodology, which included 79 personal interviews with faculties at a sample of universities across the country, standing of what it means to be built and still maintained and staffed by the white mainstream of power. Racism is alive and well, as one Black female faculty member told us. She said, "It is so subtle, it is so hidden, but specific things that come to mind are things I should often feel like I shouldn't be here, or that my presence here is not wanted or expected. This makes me feel that maybe the academy is just not for me. What could I possibly have to offer?" this young woman said. In the interviews we conducted in the equity myth, such comments were not unusual. Feelings of alienation and low self-esteem were very common to our respondents. At this higher educational level, multiculturalism in society had also failed to achieve an educational environment that meets the needs of its increasingly diverse populations. So how does racism affect the university, and specifically racialized faculty? The results of our research on this topic uncovered many of the ways in which racialism plays a major role, specifically with respect to faculty and to graduate students. The effects of racialization begin with graduate students and later move to faculty. There is also some evidence that there is racism directed at undergraduate students, but we did not study this in this particular research. Graduate students first. What happens? They often do not receive enough training or education in race-related issues during the course of their studies. This is largely related to the paucity of racialized professors in their program of study, and especially in science subjects. Often they have difficulty finding advisors to supervise their theses concerning race or racialization. This also relates to the small numbers of racialized professors in many disciplines, again, especially in the hard sciences. And even in social sciences, the new faculty who are available and interested are often overburdened with too many students or student requests. And just a footnote on the science issue, what we found basically is that faculty, certainly in engineering in physics, in chemistry, in biochemistry, in astronomy, etc. They never even heard of some of these issues because their disciplines simply do not ever encounter them. In another instance of evidence, the wording of letters of reference. When, for example, students need to request reference letters from faculty who are not overly interested in their topics and who write superficial letters of recommendation, of course, very often the results are not in favor of the student. Another issue, whose voices are heard and embraced in classrooms and at decision-making tables? Racialized students are often not given the attention and respect when attempting to participate in discussion or at meetings where decisions are made. This is true in public meetings, in departmental meetings, and in meetings of any kind. Among those who are invited to present at panels and conferences. Now, we all know that graduate students are often invited to participate in university panels, discussion groups, and sometimes even at professional conferences, but racialized students are less often chosen. The excuse, quote unquote, given sometimes is that their topics of research are not always of universal or great interest to the audiences. Racialized students are awarded fewer research grants because their research is often on race-related issues. Now, turning to faculty, how is, and this is, I think, the main problem, how is productivity in the academy measured? This manifests itself in many ways, especially for promotion and tenure decisions. Some racialized faculty come from other areas of the world, and their universities are not recognized by North American schools. While they may have been hired to teach, promotion and tenure decisions can be influenced by the alleged lack of status of the undergraduate university from which they came, especially when this university takes place overseas and in some of the less developed areas of the world. Racialized faculty are often penalized because their research, which is often community-based, is not considered to be worthy. This is especially true when the methodology is informal and when the researcher is a member of the community being studied. Their areas of study often do not lend themselves to mainline journals, and their articles are often published in smaller localized journals or other publications that are community-based. These kinds of publications do not have the prestige of large-scale national and international journals. How are professional networks available to racialized faculty? University faculty find access and the use of professional or even informal networks very valuable to further their work. But racialized faculty do not appear to have equal access to these useful professional networks. Now, one of the main problems in the structure of the modern university is what is included and excluded from the disciplinary canons. The disciplines which constitute the typical calendar are based on old traditions, such as, for example, English language and literature. What about the language and literature of other societies in the world? Classical history, as opposed to say, modern history, which is so problematic in our times. And usually the history is European history, not local history. Racialized faculty are often involved in more modern and up-to-date disciplines or areas of study which are not recognized as legitimate in the traditional canon. Think, for example, how difficult it was in some areas of the university to institute Black Studies programs, because Black Studies, of course, is not a discipline. It's not part of the canon. Although many universities have in more recent times added to their traditional disciplines, it is still difficult for racialized faculty to find a home or introduce students to them. Now, another factor is, how does faculty fit in, quote unquote, or make good colleagues? What is a good colleague? Decisions around who fits in or who will make a good colleague are very much in evidence when hiring takes place, especially during the interview. Place of origin, the accent of the applicant, even their names may indicate a lack of fit, so-called. It is often assumed that applicants who are different will also have different values, different ideas, different lifestyles, which make for a bad fit, quote unquote. Another area of concern, teaching evaluations that prize standardization and support the dominant culture. Teaching evaluations, as we know, are extremely important in determining a faculty member's rapport or lack of it with students. Some universities still use very traditional standardized teaching evaluation forms rather than the newer methods of evaluation, such as peer observation, teaching portfolios, and the like. Biases based on race, as well as gender, accent, and other features are frequently used by students to evaluate teaching performance. How resumes and qualifications are interpreted. When credentials were obtained in regions, accents, and culture that are not known to the standard academy. In the work and support, which is disproportionately taken up by faculty. What happens, we discover, is that students who are racialized or who are indigenous seek out the few professors available to them in these fields. This means that they don't get the quality of attention that they deserve because these few professors who are either racialized and or indigenous are just overburdened already with students. So it means, therefore, that the support level for this sort of work is difficult. And finally, we find the lack of racialized leadership of universities, whose leaders are largely white and male. I don't know how that compares with the United States, but in Canada, that is still very much the case. And I am at the moment actually conducting some new research on the makeup of university administrations. And a quick survey of the 15 leading universities in Canada revealed that all but 2 had white male professors as presidents. Turning now to the university today. In the latest census, the numbers of racialized university professors, which includes all racialized groups, increased from 17% in 2006 to 21% in 2016, according to our last census in Canada. There has been a slight improvement of Black university teachers, increasing from 1.8 to 2.0 in 2016, the latest. Well, there's one census that in fact just came out 2 weeks ago. Many of these are second generation, in addition though to newly arrived immigrants. And as the numbers of racialized faculty slowly grew at urban universities, but also in the smaller areas of the country, as in the West, echoes of discontent and complaint began to be heard. And very slowly, changes began to take place. According to what I found, in the United States, Black professors form only 6% of the faculty population, compared to 14% of undergraduate students who are Black. Now, having said all of all of these problems at the university, let me make a few comments about what is really happening right now, the changes that are taking place. There are changes taking place. Now, the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement and the recurring protests have spurred institutions to action, and that, of course, includes universities. Most universities now have created some sort of action plan, given different titles, but basically it is a move to make changes. So one of the first examples of this is that they are promoting the hiring of racialized faculty. In the first instance, in many places now, racialized applicants and Indigenous faculty are given priority in terms of the possibility of being hired. The restructuring of course offerings, particularly those in the old traditional canons, have also certainly been occurring. The holding of meetings, conferences, the creation of task forces, etc., are all means of finding and recruiting diverse faculty and staff. Most of the larger universities in Canada have created Black Studies degree programs, and most of them have some sort of special programs for Indigenous studies. So that there is usually also the addition of an equity dimension to their administrative structure, usually a vice president or a vice provost, or at least an equity director. The role of EDI, of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and sometimes decolonization is added to that, and has been markedly enhanced. One of our major universities recently announced the creation of a special task force on anti-Black racism. And 77% of universities currently reference EDI institutions' strategic plan or longer-term planning documents. And 70% of institutions either already have or are in the process of developing an EDI action plan. However, they are hampered by difficulties. And what are these difficulties? Well, as you would expect, there is a lack of money, a lack of resources given to these programs. There is difficulty attracting and retaining diverse talent. Sorry, my phone is ringing. I'm going to try to get rid of that. So difficulty in attracting and retaining talent, including in the senior leadership. Institutional systems, policies, structures, and cultures that can hinder progress. There are a lot of old-fashioned stuff going on. There's a lack of data on institutional challenges. There is insufficient information on the best practices for EDI. Now, a diversity in senior leadership, especially of racialized people, is evident, seriously evident. Approximately 60% of senior university leaders identify as belonging to at least one of the designated equity-deserving groups, that is, women, racialized people, people with disabilities, indigenous people, LGBTQ 25+ people. So that's 60% of university leadership people. While racialized people represent 8% of senior leaders, they represent 21% of full-time faculty and 31% of doctorate holders and 22% of the Canadian general population. While the proportion of women in senior leadership positions is 49% in universities, and it's now almost proportionate to that of men. But there still remain few women in the executive head and vice president positions at Canadian universities. In the research that I'm currently conducting, examining the websites of 15 major universities, 12 were led by white males, 2 by white women, and 1 by a person of South Asian origin. More racialized people, however, were appointed to the next level of vice and associate presidents and vice provosts, and also directors of EDI offices. Now, while white men were in the most powerful positions, many of these universities in our sample had lower level equity positions occupied by people of color. What is most interesting is the intervening position in the hierarchy, which were overwhelmingly directed by people of color, mainly Blacks. These are the people whom we have decided to interview in our new project. Our earlier conversations with many of them have led us to believe that they were deeply unhappy with their positions. Although their titles were grand, their actual level of power was minimal. What we heard were mainly complaints about their inability to carry through initiatives without the approval of those immediately above them in the hierarchy. So we are now planning another research-based, interview-based study on these people, precisely to explore with them what their position really means. What are they able to accomplish? And it seems very little. And what is already happening is that quite a number of people who to these positions have already left them for the main reason that they are not within the real power structure of the administrative elite. So finally, today, as we move ever more into more racially and ethnically diverse societies, schools, like other need to adjust accordingly. Inclusivity, structural barriers, and systemic biases need to be challenged, and not only changed, but transformed. That is the challenge that faces traditional multicultural values and approaches to schooling, and should lead to a transformational approach to the traditions of the educational institutions. These are big words and ideas, but true transformative and structural change in an antiquated and aloof remains problematic in our increasingly neoliberal world. So let me stop right there, and perhaps there will be comments and questions, which hopefully I will be able to reply to. I just want to briefly make one fleeting comment, that all of these changes, which I have actually made as the basis of my presentation to you, they're really rather minimal in the long run, because what is needed is transformational structural change. And is that really going to happen at these universities, which are so mired in their own traditions and their own history? Frankly, I'm rather doubtful. I really am. And we in Canada already have a movement, an academic movement, made up of some very well-known, at least in our country, researchers, professors, senior members of various disciplines who are on record for challenging the need for transformation. In other words, changing the whole system from top to bottom. And that is the doctrine that they are pursuing so far, with very little success. But what this movement, which is described, as that awful leftist bunch, but what it means is that the changes that have been made, good as they are insufficient in the final run. So let me just leave it there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. I believe we have time for a few questions, if anybody has one. Tangela? Kevin?
Thank you very much, EJ. Thank you, Professor Henry. Thank you so much for the great speech and to bring us your research. Your research is inspirational, and I want to ask you. I have many questions to ask you, because I know that your professor was Erica Bourguignon at Ohio State, and she was Herskewitz's student, and I've been doing a book on Herskowitz for 30 years and so on. So that's those. But this stuff that you've been doing recently, the stuff now that you report to us about, is really inspirational, and it's actually of the moment here at our university as well. And so thank you so much for this talk. And also, this is right and exactly in line with our late colleague Trevor Purcell's research and political interests too. So it just couldn't be more timely. My question was this: is about is there any backlash that's going on in Canada that's identifiable? Groups that are in opposition to these changes, that identify themselves. You may or may not know that in Florida right now, there have been state laws. It's a right-wing Republican governor who's recently reelected. The state House and Senate are controlled by Republicans. They've done laws that we are now having to respond to that will prevent us from teaching certain things
Yes.
that are, where we are, these certain bills and so on that we have to, abide by as that becomes state law. Further, they've changed, they're about to implement this law about, it's a post-tenure review, which basically does away with tenure because it gives all the, it's not the normal process. It gives the ability to basically revoke someone's tenure, even though we have annual reviews, of course, post-tenure and stuff like that, to revoke someone's tenure. That would be, a political decision that could come down as based on what the provost would decide. You've probably seen where there've been all these other officials, university presidents at the University of Florida, for example, at FIU and so on, that were appointed in despite of protests and so on. So we are facing the backlash here, and it's become codified into law and so on. So my question is, now thinking comparatively, is something like that happening in Canada? And if so, what are these forces of reaction?
To my knowledge, they're not. Now, we have been watching Florida very carefully and the debate over CRT, especially in those of us who study race-related issues. And almost every scholar of repute in this field does make use of CRT, that their critical race theory is the framework for most of us, with minor, additions, changes, and so on, but that's the framework and is totally accepted. Now, to my knowledge, there has not been any such movement as has happened in your state. Now, that is not to say that there aren't individuals who may feel that way, but the temper of the society does not really allow an open expression of those. So I do know that my colleagues who are in this transformational almost movement find that they're treated badly, basically, but at least to some extent, but most of them are senior in their professional status, and they are protected by such things as tenure, for example. And so that hasn't really seriously become an issue. And personally, I'm an ex-American, and so I do know a little bit about the differences between the two societies. I just do not see it happening in Canada, because I don't think Canadian society and even the university, the culture of university is different. I don't think they would allow a ban on teaching a subject matter. I mean, it would be against all their basic principles and values, and wouldn't be acceptable. So my general answer to your question, Kevin, is probably no.
Okay, thank you.
I guess you can come to Canada and then you can still teach whatever you like.
I wish.
All right. I think Kieran has his hand up. Is that, yeah.
Yes, I don't see any other hands at the moment. So again, Professor Henry, thank you for agreeing to give this talk. I'm so glad to hear you talk. I'm so glad to continue to get to know you. I look forward to our future conversations elsewhere. Regarding your talk, I had a kind of a quick detail question, and then a couple of other larger questions. Your data, when you're looking at these sort of unequal treatment of populations, did that include a discussion or analysis of First Nation people within the universities?
Yes, indeed. Our problem with that is that the samples is so small. when we began this research, it was about 4 years ago, and there were hardly any Indigenous professors at that point, of very, very few. Now that has changed. There are more, not enough, but there are more. So almost always, certainly in our survey questions and our survey methodology and in our personal interviews, we included actually whoever Indigenous faculty we could find and who agreed, say, to do an interview. They are more, the numbers are a bit larger now. So maybe, and the independence of Indigenous studies at most of the major big universities, that's very apparent.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of more. In your discussion of all these issues, looking at my notes here, you'd mentioned the sort of problems with professional networks and disciplinary canons and all these dynamics here. Was there ever discussion about pedagogical problems, either by the students or by faculty, as far as the ways to approach students, the reactions from students to faculty within the teaching moment?
I think that's coming, and to some extent does exist now. But there, you see, we don't really know or hear about cases like that where there is a realistic discussion going on. What we hear about are the few negative cases that have sprung up. The fact where racist teachers have still remained employed despite the allegations against them. One very famous incident or situation with a professor at the University of Toronto who came from, it was either Oxford or Cambridge, a very esteemed of his profession, but a racist, and he was essentially fired. He was fired by the university, and he went back to England. So you know that made a great was very, very newsworthy. And Kevin mentions Philip Rushton at the University of Western Ontario, which took place some years ago, who was a psychologist, and it was also a racist. So some of these extremist cases make the news. I'm not sure that totally answers your question, but I think there are a lot of people who are teaching today in Canadian universities, the new younger generation, who are with the new developments and who are extremely sensitive and caring in terms of the student body and of trying to change their language, change their mode of thinking, and so on, so as not to offend people. That, I think, is very evident on the campuses in many Canadian societies today.
Thank you.
Tangela, do you have a question?
I do. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Henry, for your lecture this evening. And thank you to the Trevor Purcell committee for putting this all together. Professor Henry, my question is about the decolonization aspect of EDI in Canadian universities. Here in the States, we do DEI and sometimes be belonging, but rarely, if ever, do I hear decolonization being mentioned or brought into those conversations. And so my question is, what does decolonization look like in that context, like within the Canadian university system?
I think in the first instance, that's a wonderful question, and I'm not sure I'm have the kind of expertise to answer it fully. But what I think is happening is that there is a great deal of awareness that face indigenous communities, cultures, students, professors, comes as a result of their history of having been denied access to their own lands. And it is what has also happened in more recent times is the whole notion of the need for reconciliation between the history that was imposed on them and the history and culture that they come out of. So those are two aspects of decolonization. And the third, I think, is the one that has most authority at the moment, and that is the situation of schools, where indigenous children were taken by the state and by primarily the Catholic Church and sent to residential schools in order to wipe out their indigeneity and make them into standard Canadians, in the process killing quite a number of them. Recently, there has been the discovery of grave sites at these residential schools where young children were interred as a result of maltreatment. So there is the recognition that not only were their minds being tampered with, but their bodies as well. So those are sort of elements, I think, that are out in the society in general, and specifically, certainly at the university. The recognition that Indigenous people have a magnificent culture and history, which has to be recognized and identified and made part of the mainstream, if they so choose. But I'm not, and I've never claimed to be a specialist in Indigenous studies. So I'm, I think there's probably a good deal more that could be said to your question. But basically adding the D, to EDI simply means that we recognize that decolonization is a process that we now have to go through.
Thank you for that. That was a perfect response. And it's interesting because Kieran and I are co-facilitating a faculty learning community on decolonizing social science and humanities courses. So that's part of the reason why I asked too. And so I just appreciate your comments, because I kind of come from the same line of thought where when I think about decolonization, I automatically think about Indigenous populations, but I know other people don't think about it in that way. And so I just appreciate your insights.
Good. Okay, thank you.
All right, are there any other questions? Oh, Kevin, you have your hand up again?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's just, I don't mean to monopolize, but if no one else has another question, I definitely do. Maybe, and Professor Henry, maybe it's because I'm really angry and stuff, but I'm going to think more about, anthropology of reactionaries, right? So in your research, in terms of the methods and all, did you interview non-people of color that are in the institution that expressed doubt about the value of these DEI, EDI, et cetera, efforts, saying, well, standards are slipping and we have to have them read Shakespeare after all, and things like that. Did you, in your research, did you record, or did you interview like the other side, people who are opposed to these?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, because but it's easy. It's easy to answer. The answer is no. We did not approach, we were aware of people who held that point of view, but we did not approach them. Mainly because this is still a sensitive topic. And we wanted to really make sure that we had a good representative sample of people who cooperated with us. And word gets around, and then we thought, it might really generate some bad feelings, and that's the last thing you want when you're doing research in a field that you don't control and have no control over. I mean, we could have been kicked out at any point, basically. So no, that's sort of didn't happen, but it's a very interesting thought, because I know there are people who feel that way. Yeah, absolutely. And they can't be kicked out because of tenure. And presumably they are changing their mode of teaching, because any student will immediately complain and bring it to the dean's attention and so on. So.
Yeah, no, thank you. Because I mean, just thinking methodologically, I'm thinking back to the classic chapter by Laura Nader about studying up, right? And so
Yeah.
these are some of the things for those of us who have to study up. Like you're saying, you're not in control. You are, lucky to get an interview with someone. Think about how busy we are as faculty. If someone wants to interview us about, our research or about whatever,
Yeah.
you have to schedule it, and it's
Yeah.
a certain amount of time, and it's not like the sort of traditional living in the village and you see everyone every day,
Exactly.
and so on and so forth. So that's very interesting. I can imagine that those are the kinds of things that you have to sort of think about and try to account for
Yeah.
when you're thinking about like what's happening, and then what are the sort of forces that are against these kinds of things. Okay, no, thank you so much.
Yeah, but one thing I should add, Kevin, and I should admit to, I don't want to set myself up as some sort of guru, but a lot of the people that we interviewed, and I would say the vast majority of the interviews, my name is known to them. They're racialized people, and they know who is doing the research on race. And they know that I started this whole anti-racist field of study in Canada. So I had an entree, let me put it that way, because they know my work, and they know that I'm trustworthy in terms of not only my values, but what I would be reporting and publishing and so on. So I think that certainly helped me. And I might add, just as a footnote, because it happened very recently, my work is now really has been recognized in Canada too, because I think I'm called the grandma of racial studies. And I was recently awarded the Order of Canada, which is Canada's highest civilian medal for that, with my colleague, which I found that very gratifying, of course, to have your work recognized at that level. So anyway, I think I have an advantage in this field simply because my name is known, and my work is known. Yeah. Which I sometimes think, Kevin, because I sometimes sort of think, what would have happened if we had stayed in the United States? Because both my late husband and my career really flourished in this country. So I have a lot to be thankful for here. Yeah.
Well, we're at 6 o'clock, and I want to thank Dr. Henry. Thank you very much for appearing in our lecture series. It was a very informative talk, and I think that, well, I certainly got a lot out of it. So thank you very much.
Thank
Well,
you, Dr.
thank you.
Henry. Thank you so much. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Henry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll reach out to you about our next conversation. through email.
Absolutely. Okay.
Okay.
Well,
great to be here.
goodbye, everybody, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity of sharing my views.
It was our honor.